So my prediction about the wall has finally come true. I've been saying this for a while now, that Donald Trump is going to declare a national emergency and basically try to build it on his own. Now, the timing of my prediction was off because he kept announcing, like, oh, I'm going to give an Oval Office address, and he gave an Oval Office address, and he didn't do it then. Then, like, not even a week later, he's like, oh, I'm going to give another speech, and this speech is going to be, whatever. I don't know if it was from the Oval Office again or whatever the fuck it was, but I don't think it was. I think it was from the press room. But he gave another speech, and I'm like, okay, now he's going to do it, and he didn't do it. And I'm like, okay, I know you're going to do it. What do you, like, just do it. Like, why are you... To be clear, I don't want him to do it, but I knew he was going to do it. It was just a matter of him actually doing it. And then finally, a few days ago, he did it. And it was a speech from the Rose Garden. It was a rambling, meandering, lost speech, which is, expected from Donald Trump at this point. But finally, my prediction has come true. He declared a national emergency. I'm going to show you a short news clip here on it, and then we'll come back and talk about it.
President Trump tonight, who today went on live TV from the Rose Garden and declared a national emergency, citing an invasion on the border. He is trying to go around Congress now to get billions more in taxpayer money for his wall that he campaigned on, saying Mexico would pay for it. Tonight, Democrats and now the growing list of Republicans who say this move could create a slippery slope for future presidents. Our chief White House correspondent, Jonathan Karl, right there in the Rose Garden, asking the president about the Republicans who don't want this.
In the Rose Garden, the president did what he had long threatened to do, declaring a national emergency to get billions of dollars Congress wouldn't give him to build his border wall.
We're talking about an invasion of our country.
Congress only approved $1.4 billion for the wall, but the White House says the president can get an additional $6.5 billion using executive and emergency powers to shift money from other projects. Most of it would come from the Pentagon, money that is intended for counter-narcotics efforts and emergency military construction. The president insists military leaders are on board.
They think this is far more important than what they were going to use it for. I said, what were you going to use it for? And I won't go into details, but didn't sound too important to me.
The president made it clear he fully expects to be sued.
We will have a national emergency, and we will then be sued, and they will sue us in the Ninth Circuit, even though it shouldn't be there. And we will possibly get a bad ruling, and then we'll get another bad ruling, and then we'll end up in the Supreme Court, and hopefully we'll get a fair shake.
In court, the administration will have to prove there is a real emergency, something the president seemed to undermine with his own words.
I could do the wall over a longer period of time. I didn't need to do this, but I'd rather do it much faster.
He is incomprehensibly dumb. Dude, you had one job, and that one job was to not undermine your own case. And so when he says, like he did at the end there, I didn't need to do this, but I wanted to do it much faster. That statement alone undermines the argument that it's a national emergency. If it's an emergency, you have to do something right now, which is why you declare an emergency. You can't, as you're declaring an emergency, say, I didn't have to do this. I mean, anybody who supports this, what he's doing here, immediately had to facepalm when they heard him say that. Because you totally contradicted your case. I mean, just to draw a parallel here, let's say in response to 9/11, George W. Bush was like, okay, we're going to declare a national emergency, and I need to send, extra security to the airports. I need to do this. I need to do that. And then when he was pushed on it, he's like, I don't have to do this. Everybody's like, what the fuck are you talking about? What are you talking about? What do you mean you don't have to do it? If you're saying you don't have to do it, then it's not a national emergency. Obviously, it is a national emergency. You can't, to undercut your own case in such a clear way is really just... It's so Trumpian. Because this is what he does, and we spoke about this when he was campaigning. He knows how to speak out of both sides of his mouth, and what actually happened is people just kind of projected onto him what they wanted him to be for. So while he's saying for example, on foreign policy, I don't know why we're in Iraq, I don't know why we're in Afghanistan, we're gonna get out of there, we're gonna stop nation building. They're not even thankful that we're there, so we're gonna come back, we're gonna build our own country up. He said that at the same time that he was saying stuff like we're gonna bomb the shit out of them, talking about ISIS. So on the one hand, he's like, I'm gonna escalate more and destroy the enemy ruthlessly, and on the other hand, he was like, we're gonna stop doing the nation building and stop doing all these dumb wars. So what happened is, among the actual Republican-based voters, the ones who are more hawkish read into him, he said he wants to bomb the shit out of them, so I'm for that. And then the ones who are less hawkish and more paleocons, the neocons, read into him, he doesn't want to do the bombings, he wants to end the wars. And so he says both things at the same time. At the same token, remember when there was I think it was a Fox Business debate, and there were people outside, I think, protesting for higher wages, and Trump said, wages are too high in that debate. Wages are too high? What the fuck? So that's like a wink and a nod to the business class, the owner class, the elites. That's a wink and a nod to the free market laissez-faire conservatives. But then at the same time, he would do populist rhetoric on the campaign trail, and he would say, I'm not going to let your jobs be outsourced. NAFTA was terrible. We're going to destroy the TPP. So he was trying to do both at the same time. Hey, look at me. I'm fighting for the working class. And by the way, wages are too high. And I'm not fighting for the working class. I'm fighting for the owner class. So this is so Trumpian. He just says everything at the same time, and then you project onto him, that's what he really believes, that thing that I believe. And that's the thing he's going to fight for. So this is another class. He's so used to contradicting himself that now he's doing it in the middle of declaring a national emergency. He's like, and I definitely don't need to do this, but I'm going to do this. Okay. Now, the next point is about right-wing philosophy, because they have told us for the longest time, we're principled in our belief in small government, bro. That's what we're all about. If you could sum up our philosophy in as simple a way as possible, our philosophy would be the smaller the government, the better. Big government bad, small government good, and, leave more to the private sector, shrink the size of government. And what this shows is, and it shouldn't surprise anybody that this is, they're not about what they say they're about. What this shows is that's just not correct, that on many issues, they actually want bigger government, and on some issues, they want as big a government as possible. The same people who say they're for small government also support warrantless, illegal, unconstitutional NSA spying. The same people who say they're for small government also supported a giant Wall Street bailout, multi-trillion-dollar Wall Street bailout during the subprime mortgage crisis and the Great Recession. They also support corporate welfare that goes to ExxonMobil and the oil companies. And, again, we could keep talking about issues where their belief is not small government. Abortion, they want to regulate it as strictly as possible. When they say they're anti-regulation, but when it comes to that, they're pro-regulation. So, listen, all I want from this crowd is just to be honest about what your opinions are. Like, just don't turn around and use that, I'm for small government bullshit talking point the next time a Democratic president does something you don't like. Argue on the merits of why you disagree with that thing. Don't argue and pretend you're taking a principled stand against the size of government, because it's obviously the case that that's not your real belief. You just weaponize that talking point when it's convenient for your ideology. But this is a clear example of Trump saying, hey, I want to grow the government massively and have a giant militarized border and build a wall through a unitary executive theory, which basically bypasses Congress because they have the power of the purse, but I'm just going to bypass that. So this is something, if a Democratic president did something of similar scale, bypassing Congress, they would be fucking screaming and calling him a dictator and a tyrant, and their hair would be on fire, and they would say this is insanity. But most of the elected Republicans are like, yeah, wall is awesome, so I'm with Trump on this. Now, to be fair, some of them have, said, no, I don't agree with this on principle, and good for them. But most of them are just exposing themselves as not having that principled belief in small government. Then probably the most important point is whether or not this really is a national emergency. Because if that's what this hinges on in court, then there's no way this goes anywhere at all. Because you can actually, like, objectively measure shit. And, like, for example, Trump keeps citing, he cites two things. Crime and drugs as to why this is a national emergency. Oh my God, there's so much crime from the illegal immigrants. Oh my God, there's so many drugs being brought in by the illegal immigrants. So that's why we need this wall. That's why it's an emergency. And that's why we're bypassing Congress and we're just going to build it on our own here. But as you guys know, if you've listened to the show for a long time, there was a study that came out maybe a year or two ago from a right-wing think tank, nonetheless, which found that undocumented immigrants and documented immigrants both, respectively, have lower crime rates than native-born citizens. What? Yeah, so that flies directly in the face of, you know, the propaganda narrative that he's built. Like, even at his State of the Union address, he brings these angel families to the to his speech, and angel families, for those of you who don't know, that those are people who've had family members who've been murdered by undocumented immigrants. Now, do I feel bad for those people? Of course, I feel bad for anybody and their family who were murdered. Murder is horrendous and heinous and should be punished. But the fact that you're only focusing on the undocumented immigrant murders, you're trying to build a narrative, and that narrative is, hey, look at all these families who were impacted by murderous undocumented immigrants. Therefore, we should crack down on the entire undocumented immigrant community. We should crack down on all undocumented immigration. And so he uses that as propaganda to try to build the case for the wall. So it's a cynical argument because, again, when you zoom out and you look at the macro picture, there's actually fewer, undocumented immigrant murderers and documented immigrant murderers. Murderers commit less crime than native citizens. So if this is what the discussion is going to be in court, Trump is toast because he has no real argument here that this is a national emergency. If that's a national emergency, there's about 1,000 other things that are bigger emergencies. And then also on the point of drugs, most of the drugs that get into this country come through legal ports of entry. So they don't, it's not like Steve King said, that you have undocumented immigrants with cantaloupe calves dragging the drugs across the border in the desert. That's not what's happening. They're coming into this country through legal ports of entry. So there's clever ways that they hide it. However, hey, we put it in the tires of our truck are lined with coke or whatever the fuck the case may be. They come up with clever ways to get it in through legal ports of entry. So for you to say we're going to build a wall and it's going to make sure people can't smuggle in drugs through the desert, that's not what's happening. And he also cites the opioid crisis. Dude, what do you want to do? You want to build a wall around GlaxoSmithKline and Merck and all the pharma companies? Because that's where, that originates from. So for him to try to make the case in court, this is a national emergency, you're not even going to come close to making that case because your crime point is just factually not true and your drugs point is just factually not true. Now, it is possible, though, that, it might get slapped down a couple times, then it goes to the Supreme Court. Then there is a chance that the Supreme Court says, okay, we're going to let you do this. But if the Supreme Court does decide we're going to let Trump do this, because they say, for example, they could say something like, whether or not it is a national emergency is irrelevant. It's up to the discretion of the president to determine whether or not it's a national emergency. And even if we disagree that it's a national emergency, he has the authority as president to determine what is and isn't, and therefore it is legal for him to take this course of action. There is a remote possibility, probably a tiny percentage chance that that's what they decide. And if that is what they decide, well, guess what? Many people have pointed this out, and they're correct. President Bernie Sanders can say, well, the fact that we have 32,000 to 45,000 Americans die every year because they don't have access to health care, the fact that we have medical bills being the top cause of bankruptcy in this country, that's a national emergency. So I'm going to bypass Congress. and approve and fund a Medicare for all system through a national emergency. That's one example. Another example is climate change. Hey, climate change is going to destroy the world, and all hopes at a future modern civilization, and we need to address it, and we need to address it now. So it's a national emergency. We're going to ban fossil fuels and radically and quickly move towards renewable energy and technology. I mean, you can, if you're leaving the president the discretion for that one person to determine what is and isn't a national emergency, then it's going to be on the whims of that one person to determine what is and isn't. And you're going to have massively varying different views between Democrats and Republicans and individual Democrats and individual Republicans. And you're opening up the door to basically, it's really a dictatorship. I mean, that's what that is. Like, oh, I'm just going to willy-nilly, whatever I decide, we do. And, oh, you disagree with it? Sorry, we're going to declare a national emergency, and it doesn't matter if you disagree with it. And listen, in many ways, we already have a system like this. Like, for example, Congress is supposed to, authorize war. But ever since 9/11 and onward, we've had presidents of both parties. They willy-nilly send troops wherever the fuck they want, and they just declare, oh no, this was approved through the authorization for use of military force back in the wake of 9/11, where now I get to fight terrorists no matter where those terrorists are. So the fact that I'm bombing 8 countries right now doesn't matter that we don't have a declaration of war for 6 of the 8 countries. It's still legal because I say so. So we already have kind of like a dictatorship-style system in some aspects, and this would just solidify it on the domestic front a lot more. We already have it for foreign policy. This would solidify it on the domestic front. But again, if they were to say, in the small percentage chance they do say you're allowed to do this, then a Democratic president could say for climate change, for Medicare for all, for Flint, Michigan, with their destroyed, poisoned water that is still the case, by the way, for all these other places around the country that have poisoned water. You could have an emergency declaration that builds infrastructure. So, if they were to rule that way, then you open up the door to all that by setting a precedent. Now, it also is possible, this is an even tinier percentage chance, that they say, okay, yes, the president has the ability to do this, and so we're going to go ahead and approve him doing this. But then the next time a Democrat tries to pull the same trick, they just flip-flop on that principle, the courts do, and they say, oh no, you're not allowed to declare an emergency over climate change. The fuck? So in other words, they could give the president the discretion, but say just this president, just this issue, which would be a classic, unprincipled, weaselly decision. But, far be it from the Supreme Court to do something like that. I mean, listen, the best example of this was Antonin Scalia. He was considered this, crusading, intellectual, principled justice on the court. Meanwhile, he was the biggest fucking hypocrite I've ever seen. When you go issue for issue with him, he would always flip on the principle to meet his own political ideology. So, states' rights is the perfect example of this. He would always say, oh, states' rights is so important. And that's the overriding factor, the overriding principle. Now, a good example was when Arizona wanted to basically build their own border wall, and he ruled that, of course, the state can do this. Why? Because they have states' rights. So usually the federal government is in charge of the border. And so that's the counter-argument was, it doesn't matter if Arizona wants to do something on the border. It's the federal government's responsibility to do it. We have the authority there. Arizona doesn't have the authority. So Antonin Scalia said, oh, states' rights is what this is all about, so I support Arizona's right to build a border wall. Now, what happened when a case was in front of Antonin Scalia about individual states wanting to legalize recreational marijuana? He's obviously going to stick by that same principle. States' rights, obviously any state can do what they want with marijuana because I believe in the sovereignty of the state. No, immediately flipped on the principle, and he said, the federal government overrides the state government because of the supremacy clause of the Constitution, so they don't have the right to do whatever they want with marijuana. How dare they? So he just immediately flipped on the principle whenever, it was something that matched his political ideology. I don't like it in this case, so I'm going to flip. So it is possible that you do have these far-right idiots on the court who are political ideologues who just say, yeah, Trump can do this, but no, anytime a Democratic president would try to do anything similar by declaring a national emergency that matches their ideology, can't do that. So we'll see how this unfolds, but my guess is it is most likely that this does get slapped down because it is such an overreach and it's so egregious in skirting separation of powers, but also it's provably not an emergency. So if they're looking at that evidence and having to respond directly to that evidence, it's almost impossible to give yourself enough wiggle room to say, no, the president can still do this. So my guess is this will get slapped down, but it is Trump doing what he said he would do from early on. And we have a story coming up about that in a little bit, the reaction to it. But my prediction has come true. Trump declared a national emergency and decided he's going to build the wall on his own.